welcome everyone to this very informative webinar on cybersecurity. My name is Robin Howe, and I'm the founder of USWired and Executive Vice President of Managed IT Services at Quatrro Business Support Services, our parent company. I'm sure everybody who's attending is well aware of the need for good cybersecurity against cyber threats. Most likely, most of you have at the very minimum antivirus installed, hopefully something better like EDR, Endpoint Detection and Response, which is basically antivirus with artificial intelligence. You might have a security operations center in place with security specialists who are keeping a watchful eye on your systems 24/7. Maybe you have MFA, multi-factor authentication, implemented, hopefully have good backups in case you are breached with ransomware. You might have a dark web scan tool, scanning the dark web for leaked credentials, and maybe you even have a security awareness training program in place to educate your employees or users on the latest malware. But even with all those measures in place, cybersecurity is not a set it and leave it solution. It requires constant vigilance because your organization isn't static. It's fluid. And more importantly, the cyber threat landscape is undergoing constant change. So just like you need an annual physical checkup, you need to do a cybersecurity risk assessment for your organization, at least annually, if not more often. So with that said, I am privileged to introduce you to our guest speaker today, Jason McNew, who will talk more about the elements of a cybersecurity risk assessment and give further insights on how best to protect your organization from the latest cyber threats. Jason has over 25 years of experience in the IT field, including 12 years at the White House Communications Agency in Camp David, where he worked on some of the most secure systems in the world. Jason is an Air Force veteran and holds a master's degree from Penn State in information sciences, cybersecurity, and information assurance. Jason also holds a CISSP certification, which, if you haven't heard of that, that is the gold standard for cybersecurity professionals, very difficult to attain. In 2017, Jason founded Stronghold Cybersecurity, helping defense contractors be CMMC ready. In 2020, he sold his company to Appalachia Technologies, where Jason served as senior engineer for cybersecurity compliance and risk. And last year, Jason joined ConnectWise's global security sales team as principal solutions advisor. So before Jason comes on, I want to ask all of you to hold your questions to the end. And please stick around for the entire webinar to be eligible for the $75 Grubhub or Uber Eats gift card and to be in the raffle for the $250 Amazon gift card. Also, we'll be giving each attendee a complimentary dark web scan report to see whether you have any leaked email credentials for your company domain. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jason.
Hey, thanks, Robin. I won't spend too much more time. I'll expound a little bit on what you were saying about my background. Kind of the key takeaway there is I spent a lot of years working in buildings with no windows, surrounded by barbed wire and machine guns and that kind of stuff. So you think of these sort of extreme security environments, top secret special access programs, compartmented information, those kinds of things. So it provides a different perspective on security than you would find in regular enterprise or certainly in the small to mid-sized business space. And here's our agenda. We're going to go over a couple of definitions. We're going to talk about what a risk assessment is, what to measure. We have an analogy to use to kind of explain risk assessments a little bit. We love our analogies. Outcomes, some ongoing cyber concerns, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers. So next slide, please. So let's go over some definitions here. Cybersecurity, more than anything else, is the business of managing risk. And a risk is probability times impact, more or less. It's the probability that something will happen and then the impact that bad thing will happen. And that's how we measure risk. So it's a combination of the probability of an event occurring and the consequences by definition here. A threat is anything that has the potential to damage an asset. And the threats could be man-made or they could be human-made. An asset's anything that's worth protecting, and that could be data, people, it could be systems, it could be buildings, anything that we're going to talk about in our risk management plan or our BCDR, business continuity and disaster recovery. There are many things that we need to protect. as part of protecting our business interests, and those things are assets. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses in the design, implementation, or operation of a system. And vulnerabilities, we tend to talk about technical vulnerabilities, things like misconfigured system, missing patches, missing firewall rules. But a vulnerability could also be poorly trained humans, or humans that click on phishing emails, or physical vulnerabilities. There are all kinds of vulnerabilities, not just virtual ones. The inherent risk is the risk level without considering any actions taken to mitigate the threat. So inherent risk would be like, for example, driving your car without any car insurance, and making the decision to do that, saying, well, we're going to do that. We're going to accept the risk that we're going to get sunk financially. That would be kind of just a simple example of an inherent risk would be not having insurance of some kind. The residual risk is the risk that's left over after safeguards have been put in place. So let's go back to our inherent risk. The residual risk would be the risk that's left over after we purchase car insurance. So let's say that we have $1,000 deductible. Now the residual risk is that we smash up the car, and then we have that residual risk that we may have to pay $1,000 for the deductible, which is much better than the risk of losing an entire car, or the risk of injuring a person or property that could be hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, or something like that. And depending how much money we want to spend and how much work we want to put in, there's always going to be some residual risk left over, which is accepted risk. Again, cybersecurity is the practice of risk management. It is very systematic. Controls are activities that mitigate or eliminate certain risks or threats. And controls, there's two basic types of controls for the purpose of cybersecurity. We have administrative controls and then technical controls. And an administrative control might be something like firewall rules or intrusion detection or EDR. And technical controls are things like policies and procedures. For example, an acceptable use policy that says that you won't do online shopping at lunch and that kind of thing. Policies define a set of general statements and guarantee consistent performance. Policies and procedures are part of your overarching cybersecurity program. You hear us talk about people, process, and technology a lot, and that process part, you need to have policies and procedures in place in order to make sure that we have scalable, repeatable, definable, measurable, mature cybersecurity processes in place. So those policies and procedures, the procedure here is the last thing. I get ahead of myself, but a procedure defines the exact steps you should take when performing an activity. So, for example, a policy might say that we wipe all brand new machines that we get, and then the procedure says what we do to reload Windows on them. For example, a policy and a procedure, they work together. Next slide, please, Robin. What is a risk assessment? Next slide. So, a risk assessment starts with a framework, and a framework means a common language. Now, just to give you an example of what a common language might mean, I think we're all empirically familiar with frameworks. Let's say, for example, the National Electric Code, right? And we all kind of know what that is, even if we're not intimately familiar with it. I've read the entire thing several times when I was working for the White House. But the reason I say that we're empirically familiar with it, let's say you'll go into a bakery or a brewery or some commercial building, or you go into a residence and you see, the outlets are 6 feet apart and they're 18 inches above finished floor, and the wire gauges are all the same, and you have 15 amp circuits and 20 amp circuits. That stuff is all made regular by the National Electric Code, which is sort of a framework for everyone to follow, and it's for the purpose of fire, life safety, National Fire Protection Act. And in cybersecurity, a corollary to this might be something like NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technologies, the Cybersecurity Framework, the CSF. And the CSF is something that cybersecurity practitioners hold near and dear to our hearts, kind of like an electrician would hold the National Electric Code near and dear to their hearts, something that we have to know inside and out. The cybersecurity frameworks, they're a system of standards, guidelines, and best practices to manage risks. It prioritizes a flexible, repeatable, and cost-effective approach to promoting the protection and resilience of your organization. So we don't just make all this stuff up, so to speak. And the CSF is not the only cybersecurity framework out there. You may have heard of others. There are ones in various financial spaces. There's the CMMC, NIST 800-171. There's ISO 27001, which is common in Europe. But I believe that the CSF will become like the National Electric Code of Cybersecurity in a few years' time. And everything that ConnectWise is doing with ourselves and our partners and with our partners, clients, which is you, all ultimately flows down from the NIST cybersecurity framework. We're not just inventing the wheel or making this stuff up. Can I get the next slide, please, Robin? A risk assessment, a cybersecurity risk assessment refers to the process of identifying, estimating, and prioritizing information security risks. The bottom line is that you don't know what you don't know. And an IT system is complicated, and the way that it integrates with your business is complicated. And it's kind of like having, say a homeowner's inspection, or when I turn 50 next week, you turn 50 and then you go to the doctor and then they do all those tests. And then you have intelligence that you could use to make some type of a decision about managing risk. So a risk assessment is when you're going to bring in a professional like USWired, and they're going to look at people, process, and technology, and then take a look at, well, these are the things that this is where we are today. This is where we want to get. These are the resources that it's going to take to get there. And then these are the things that we could do right now, for example, to reduce our risk radically, to reduce our risk in a lot. Without spending too much money or time. There's usually some low-hanging fruit, so to speak. And the assessments, cover everything: policies, processes, employee training, technologies, physical security, users, data. Very, very comprehensive. Next slide, please. A network assessment, we need to assess internal systems, the things that are behind your firewall: firewalls, routers, switches, intrusion detection, IoT, VLANs, VoIP. And this is important because when I ran assessments I would run Nessus on enterprise networks. I almost always found about 50% more assets on a network than what the client would tell me they had. They would say, well, we think we have 500 endpoints. Now I would run Nessus on it and find 750. These are bigger companies. So it's really important to know what we have first so that we can protect it. We need to definitely look at your backup recovery plans. As far as ransomware attacks go, it's only a matter of when somebody attempts one. It may or may not succeed. But it's, kind of like a house on the coast of Florida. What's going to happen eventually. There's going to be a storm. And hopefully it's just a tropical storm, but it could be a Cat or a Cat 3 or, heaven forbid, a Cat 5, something really nasty. And some cyber attacks are like that. They wipe businesses out completely and permanently. That does happen. And we need to avoid that. And backup plans are one of the ways to do that, backing up that data and then getting it off site and encrypting and protecting and all that stuff. Employee roles. I'd mentioned before, people, process, and technology. We need to have the right talent in the right places, whether it's internal or external. And if you don't have the internal talent, then we can lean on companies like USWired to provide that talent on a fractional basis for you at greatly, very, very palatable costs. And then we'll take a look at use policies as well. Those things are important. Next slide, please. We need to take a look at attack surface. So attack surface, we want to minimize attack surface. When we think of attack surface, think about a soldier lying down in the field. You're laying down in the field because you're minimizing your attack surface. There's simply less to shoot at. Or think about, I'm a big history geek, think about the famous Civil War battle between, I think it was the Miramar and the Monitor, or the Merrimack, I can't remember which it was, but those were the two ironclad ships where most of the ship was below water. And the only thing that was above water was actually the turret and the weaponry. The rest of it was below water. Incidentally, those two bounced cannonballs off of each other for 2 hours and it was a draw, but they were reducing their attack surface by putting most of the ship underwater at that time. Points of entry are going to be attack vectors. And there's a bunch of different attack vectors that can be used, and it could be misconfigured systems, missing patches, things without intrusion detection, things without VPN. This could be unfiltered email. It could be users that we could trick. There's a lot of attack vectors that can be used when we do penetration testing and do security assessments. User habits matter. This is why we have to have user training and we have to check users. And, one of these things that we find is that no matter how much we train some people, they still click on phishing emails anyway. And if somebody's doing that after a period of 6 months or a year, then we need to make some type of a decision based on organizational impact as to whether those people continue to have a system account or not, because they're putting us at risk. Security policies, we'll take a look at security policies. Human resources procedures matter too. And this came about years ago. The evolution of that was kind of interesting because we had problems for a while that people would get terminated or transferred and they wouldn't lose their system access. And by, I see people in IT, and then you find out they go home and they're logging into stuff. But as we matured these processes, we have integrated IT, information technology, and human resources should be integrated together. So if you have a personnel action, a transfer, or a termination, IT is going to revoke or rescind their access at the exact time that they're being, terminated, which isn't fun for IT because we find out who's getting fired. But and then the last thing is going to be the legal impact. We need to take a look at what kind of data you have, for example, is going to be a big one. If you have PHI or PII, or you have some type of proprietary data or something, there is reporting requirements, or there could be legal problems or fines, then that's something that is going to introduce more risk that we need to talk about. We don't want, adverse outcome leading into big sums of money. Can I get next slide, please, Robin? Okay. Vulnerability assessment. We need to take a look at your vulnerability assessments or application flaws. You're going to have various applications on your network. And depending on what kind of enterprise you are, we still run across, old proprietary systems. I still see AS400s around, which amazes me, but they still exist. You might see old ERP. And even some modern software could be kind of wonky. Proprietary software could be weird. Software that is not real common. Sometimes it's not that well written. Operating system flaws. Sometimes we find old operating systems we can't get rid of. I found Windows XP embed running on MRI machines and things like that. Computer system flaws. So we take a look at those things. Enabled ports, processes, and services. We could use vulnerability scanners to look at all the devices on the network and then see what ports are open, what processes are running, and what services are being offered, and then take a look at that attack surface reduction. If we don't need all these services running on a given computer, then we're going to shut all those things down because even if they're not a problem today, they could become a problem tomorrow. So that's attack surface reduction. Again, that's like our soldier. Let's lie down in the field so that we're not getting shot at. We could take a look at database. Databases are also attack vectors. Remember, was it Equifax? I think that was a database. That was a mess. And then human error. Of course, there's always going to be opportunities for human errors. And there's been many examples of those. There's been some really big ones that have hit the news over the last 10 years. That Facebook SSO thing last year, boy, that was and then there was a bunch of years ago, I remember some network engineers, I think it was in Pakistan, had changed some routing tables and it propagated to half of the internet. It crashed about a significant part of the internet overseas. So sometimes we have human errors that have major cascading effects, and they can have big effects on security. Next slide, please. Dark web assessment. So this is another one of the services that USWired can provide for you. Now, the dark web, if you've ever gone on the dark web, you have to install special software. And going around the dark web would be like driving to a city that you don't know and then trying to find things without a map. It's not like the regular internet. You have to get a map somewhere and then figure out where to find things. And there's all kinds of awful stuff on it. But when data is exfiltrated, let's say, for example, that you had an account with Equifax and it got stolen, or you had an account stupidly on Ashley Madison, if you remember that breach. They would steal these databases with 10 or 100,000 or millions of users in them, and then sell them for 2 or 3 cents or 5 cents per identity or something like that. And in US dollars, that stuff really adds up. So the dark web is kind of like a bazaar where illicit things are bought and sold. But look at our diagram real quick here. A is the surface web, and the surface web is things that are accessible just through a regular internet search engine like DuckDuckGo or Yandex or Google, and then a browser. B is the deep web. These are things that you have to log into in order to get information. Think about your universities and various databases and paid databases and things like that, or just Netflix, just things like that, things that you have to log in and they have a username and a password for. And then C is going to be the dark web. So most of the information that's connected to the internet is in the deep web. It's behind authentication systems of some kind. And then there's the dark web. These are things that are only available using special software. And the Onion router Tor is not the only dark web out there. There are others. Next slide, please. By the way, and the reason why the dark web assessment with USWired matters is because if you have usernames and passwords that were stolen in the past and they've been exposed somewhere on the dark web, then having that information is good to help you make decisions about what accounts to use or disuse, or maybe tell you where your usernames and passwords were stolen. So the risk assessment is going to have a purpose before we start before we get started on that. And the first thing is going to be to identify the threat sources. What do we think the threat sources are? And it really depends who we are, what we do, where we are, who we do it for. There's a bunch of things that factor into that. Let's say, for example, if you're a defense contractor, then your threat sources might be overseas. If you are you have some type of proprietary software, maybe your competitors, you might be worried about stealing it, or you might just be worried about data thieves or internal. So we'll talk about what are our threat sources. And they could also be natural threats too. Let's say we're on the coast of California, we're in Florida or something like that. We might be worried about some type of natural disasters. Then we're going to talk about threat events. What type of threats do we think could happen? Could it be a ransomware attack? Could it be a DDoS attack? Could it be some type of exfiltration? Could it be phishing? Are we worried about some type of a natural disaster or a building fire? Are we worried about disasters, depending on where we are in the world? Once we've done that, we'll take a look at the vulnerabilities. What vulnerabilities exist that could put us in a position where we might be hemorrhaging cash? We can't operate now. We're hemorrhaging cash. We're hurting our business. What are the things that we could do with, and what are the things that we could do without? For example, if we have an e-commerce site that we're buying and selling with, we don't want that to be down ever. But let's say that our QuickBooks is down for 4 hours. That's a major inconvenience, but it shouldn't cause us to hemorrhage cash, like having some type of a market system down or something like that. Then we're going to determine the likelihood of exploitation. So we find some type of, let's say we have a vulnerability and we have to accept it because it's part of the way that we operate. We have, I'd mentioned before, an MRI machine that has Windows XP on it. Maybe you have something like that. Maybe you have some type of machinery that has, an older version of Windows on it. And we can't get rid of it for operational reasons. Now we take a look at, let's look at what is the likelihood of exploitation. How likely is it to exploit this? If it's disconnected from the network and it's in a locked room, chances are very, very low. Then we're going to take a look at the impact. Remember what I'd mentioned earlier about a threat being simply, in the simplest terms, is likelihood and impact. So we'll look at the likelihood of a threat materializing, and then we'll take a look at the impact. How bad would that be? How bad would a soldier standing up in a field taking a bullet? Probably not too good. Hopefully we're wearing, some Kevlar and battle rattle. Risk mitigation. And then lastly, we're going to calculate risk as a combination of likelihood and impact. And, cybersecurity, as I mentioned before, is the business of managing risk, and we need to apply people, process, and technology in exactly the right amounts in the right places so that we could reduce our IT-borne business risk in a way that we can quantify, mathematically. We can prove that we are getting positive return on investment for those security dollars. Next slide, please. How do you know what to measure? So the next thing we're going to talk about, what is it that when we do our risk assessment, what is it that we want to measure? Click next slide, please. I get ahead of myself in my slides, but I talk about this a lot, the three people, process, and technology. These are the things that we really need to take a look at. And this is a way to kind of simplify the NIST cybersecurity framework for the purpose of decision makers and for the purpose of a short webinar. But the NIST cybersecurity framework, I compared it before to the National Electric Code. And I don't know if you've ever read that thing, but the cybersecurity framework is similar in breadth and depth. And I say that because it has the 5 functions: identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover. It has 23 families, and then there's 108 controls underneath of that. And then the interpretation for the controls is all in NIST 800-53, and that thing is, 480, 500 pages or something like that. So it's a lot. But we've simplified all of this, for practical application to businesses of all sizes by mapping everything to people, process, and technology. But that's what we need you thinking about for cybersecurity. In the simplest terms possible is having people, process, and technology. And we need to have all of these things in the right mix in order for cybersecurity to be effective. If we spend too much money on if we spend too much emphasis on technology, it's going to be ineffective and it's going to cost lots of money. People are expensive, but we need to blend all these things. Next slide, please. So here we have a slide that fleshes out that people, process, and technology a little bit and kind of tries to explain, what happens if we have this and we don't have that, or we have that and then we don't have this. And we have the slides available in PDF form after this that you can take back to your organization and then go over this. So I think this is useful as a handout, but obviously we have no people and process and no technology. We have no defense. If we just have people, but no process and technology, we have no ability to execute. If we just have technology, look in the middle bullet hill, it's basically shelfware. Just technology alone is not going to protect. But the very bottom line here, we have the right mix of people, process, and technology, and that leads us to ultimately to success. And you want to work with subject matter experts that can help you have the right mix of people, process, and technology. And again, the real trick here is to balance operational impact and cost to make sure that we're reducing that cyber risk in a way that makes sense, academic and business and financial sense. Next slide, please. Cybersecurity culture. Cybersecurity culture matters, and this particular subject is kind of near and dear to me, having come from the environments that I've worked in. And when it comes to culture, I like to compare cybersecurity to safety. And I say that because the state of cybersecurity in today's world, I think, is probably kind of similar to the way that safety was 100 years ago. Remember the book, The Jungle? That was gross, right up in Sinclair. It changed the meatpacking industry. But, 100 years ago, there wasn't fire exits. Things were poorly lit. People were losing fingers, and it was all kind of, Wild West. And I think cybersecurity is kind of like that, but it's definitely getting a lot better. But what we have today is we have a culture of security in every modern business. If you went into an office building and told people, well, let's stack chairs in front of the fire exit, they tell you, we're not doing that. You're crazy. And the reason is because they have a culture of safety, and they've been trained on that every single year. We do our fire alarms. You have your safety posters. You have safety drills. And in enterprise places that I worked at, places like, the White House Communications Agency and CACI and Sierra Nevada Corporation, we have that culture of safety, you also have that culture of security. So when you go into the break room, not only do you see those safety posters, you see security posters. And then you're doing email and phishing training. So along with that safety training that we're doing on a quarterly basis and annual basis, we're also doing that security training. And then after a while, you get people kind of to the point where they just react reflexively to it, and they know, no, we don't stack chairs in front of the fire exits. No, I don't write my password and put it on the bottom of my keyboard. They just know that it becomes a cultural thing. So that should be a goal over time of, imparting people with knowledge, imparting beliefs, changing their perceptions, changing their attitudes, what their assumptions are towards security, norms and values. These are very good bullet points here. So as part of our cybersecurity journey, part of that people, process, and technology, we want to change people's attitudes towards security and then make it part of everything that they do every single day. Click next. Next slide, please. These are an example of policies, and I'm not going to spend too much time reading these, but I'll touch base on a couple of them. But these are examples. In the discussions I'm talking, people, process, and technology, policies and procedures are going to be part of that process. And these are examples of some of the policies that you should have as part of your cybersecurity program, your people, process, and your technologies. Acceptable use policy, data backup policy, facility use policy, social networks policy, service provider security policy. And not every single business is going to need all of these, but some more mature businesses that are bigger may need all of these. But these are some examples of things that Quatrro Business and USWired can help you with. Having these policies is important. Next slide, please. So these are going to be the components of a well-designed cybersecurity solution. And we start talking about defense in depth. When we're talking about the security assessment, we want to get from here to there, right? And all these things that you see here, 15 different items, this is when we're there. You have cyber insurance, you have firewalls, you have encryption, you have multi-factor authentication in place, SIEM and log management, security awareness, dark web research, DNS protection. But we have to get there somewhere, and all this starts with a security assessment. That's the first step on the security assessment. The first step on our security journey is just a security assessment, so that we find out where are we today, where do we need to get to, and then what is it going to take to get from point A to point B in terms of people, process, technology, and most importantly, money, really. Next slide, please. So protect your house. We're going to use, for the purpose of our security and of our security assessment, we're going to use a house as an analogy. We have we all live somewhere, whether it's a house or an apartment or a condo, and you want to protect it, right? We all have locks and that sort of thing. Click next slide, please. So this is what the blend of the right cybersecurity looks like. And we have this, in this case here, we're comparing this to a house. right? So let's say we want to secure our home, our domicile. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to identify, right? Well, what is it that we want to protect? And we're going to protect, what's your crown jewels? The things that are most important to all of us are going to be our loved ones, family, and our pets are probably your loved ones, friends, maybe. Collectibles that could be grandpa's watch, grandma's ring, things are family heirlooms, documents and valuables might be very important to you, passports, certificates, documents, those kinds of things. And then lastly, say electronics and computers. It's crazy how much these things cost. iPhone, pile of money. So if my house was burning down, I'm sure that would be one of the things I would grab after I grabbed the kids and the dog and the collectibles and the other things. So once we figure out, we talk about, well, what is it that we want to protect? What is it we need to protect? Then we can have a discussion about how to protect it. And the same is true of our business. Well, okay, we need doors and windows on our house. Keep things out, elements, perpetrators. We should have locks, education, educate people, educate our kids. Yard signs, maybe. Yard signs, incidentally, that's what we call deterrent control. Let's say that you have two homes and they both have the same exact security setup, but one has a yard sign and one doesn't. Possibly a thief might pass by the one with the yard sign and one that goes to that doesn't, because it's a deterrent control. And they are effective. They're part of defense in depth. And when you go into a casino and you see zillions of cameras in the ceilings, probably some percentage of those are not real cameras. That's an example of a deterrent control, and it is effective. And this takes us to detect. So we've done identify. We talked about protect. Now we need to detect. And you'll notice here up at the top, we have identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And I was talking about that earlier. These are the 5 functions in the NIST cybersecurity framework. But here we're using it as an analogy for our house. And protecting our house, we would think about an alarm. We would have some motion sensors, intrusion detection, doorbell cameras, maybe a neighborhood watch of some kind. And when after we've detected an event, the next thing we need to do is respond to it, right? In a home, we might have a dog. And a dog, like cybersecurity, there are controls, policy, people, process, and technology that span. A dog can protect, detect, and respond, right? And there's technology that can also do all 3 of those things. There's technology that covers 1 or 2 families. There's technology that covers 3 families. We would have homeowners insurance, for breaking and entering or damage. We should hopefully have, police. Me personally, I happen to live in the fruit belt north of Gettysburg. We don't even have a police department where I live. It's a rural farming community. It's very, very quiet and very, very safe. There's no crime there. And then maybe you would have some type of a weapon in your home, depending on where you live and then what the laws permit. Now, the last piece we have on here to the right says recover, but in this case, we're actually talking about a cybersecurity incident as opposed to a home intrusion or a break-in or vandalism or something like that. So we want to have a cyber incident response plan. An incident response plan is absolutely critical. And incidentally, if anybody here needs an incident response plan, reach out to Quattro. I have a free one that I could give you. It's a 7 or 8 pager that I got from the Defense Security Service a couple of years ago. It's an open source document. It is NIST aligned, and I have found that it's a good starting point for most companies. But just remember, it's a starting point. We don't want you to just take that and then adopt it as part of your policies and call it good. That'd be like grabbing a document off of LegalZoom and then just signing it. There's a little bit more to it than that. We want to have backup systems so that if your data gets ripped off or it gets encrypted or it gets stolen or it gets damaged or its confidentiality or integrity or availability is disrupted in some way, that we have a way to reacquire that data intact. Insurance is important. Even if we do all of the right things. And I even saw this working in these extreme security environments, there were still breaches, right? And they were in the news. The biggest one I saw was a break into the executive office of the president. I think it was in 2015, I want to say 2013. And that was something, So even you could do all the right things. You could have all the right defense people, process, technology, all the defense in depth. You have information security policy, an information manager, and you have to do everything right all the time. But the bad guys only have to be right once, right? So unfortunately, you're always some patch or misconfiguration away from a bad event. So even if we do all the right things, we could have a bad outcome anyway, and that's where insurance comes in. We've done all the right things, and then we have insurance to deal with that residual risk for us. So they're going to make us whole financially if we're not able to make ourselves whole financially. The last bullet here we have on the lower right here is emergency equipment. If you're in an area where you might be worried about wildfires or flooding or theft or something like that, it's a good idea to have some emergency equipment off site. And when you have your risk assessment done, then Quattro will speak to you about all of that. Doing okay on time, I think. Next, I tend to talk a lot and I talk fast. Next slide, please. Risk assessment outcomes. So before we conduct the risk assessment, we're going to talk about outcomes. What is it that we want to get out of this? There needs to be some type of objective. And the main outcome is going to be a roadmap that aligns your organization's objectives with the likelihood and the impact of risks. So, and when we say roadmap, well, we take a look at, this is our state today. This is where we are today. This is where we think we need to be. And that's going to be a process. This is not something that's going to happen in 1 quarter or 2 quarters. Most of the very thorough risk assessments that I have written, and these were, in-depth ones, things that took 30 or 50 hours or something like that. And I was working with companies at 100 or 200 employees, but we would usually benchmark 6 months or a year or something like that to get from point A to point B, because it's going to be a process of bringing in that people, process, and technology in a way that makes sense, and it doesn't have an unacceptable impact on finance or operations. We need to do it over time. And, I am a big, to me, it's kind of like fitness in a way. It's sort of like small wins, right? Small wins are big wins. Let's say we just wanted to improve our health, and then we said, well, let's quit sugar today. No more sugar. That alone is a big change that you can make that will have a massive impact over time. And I would compare that to, say, bringing in multi-factor authentication and then putting it over on everything that we can. That's something that's going to have a big impact on us over time. And it's not, quitting sugar might be hard for a lot of people, but once you do it, it's a lot easier than you would think. But it's a good analogy. I like my fitness analogies, and I like my car analogies and my military analogies. But it'll provide us with a comprehensive roadmap. We're going to talk about people, process, and technology, how we get point A to point B, how much this is going to cost, and then what we think we're going to save, and then what the outcomes are at the end. And all this is going to be an executive decision based on dollars and cents and operations ultimately. We're going to give you the tools, and understanding to protect against threats. So the risk assessment will provide a comprehensive, and they usually have some engineering level details, but that stuff's at the end. The risk assessment is an executive style report that is going to be intended for the C-suite and decision makers. And different organizations do them different ways. My favorite way is to provide a executive summary that's intended for the executives, and then have the technical data at the end, and then the executives can take it to the engineers and say, hey, well, can you explain what this stuff means to us, if they need to. But it's an executive level report that's intended for CFO, CEO, president, VP, board, that type of level. What do we have at the bottom here? Oh, good. Now we're done, right? No, not really. It never kind of ends. It's, again, it's like fitness. It's something that we start doing, and then we need to continue doing, fitness and exercise. Why do I need to do this? Ever evolving cyber threat landscape. One of the things that sets my profession apart from other professions, and say, for example, the legal or the finance field or the medical field, when you work in legal or finance, you have some idea what might be coming down the pike. There's some bill in committee. There's some new policy or procedure. There's some new regulation. If you work in the medical field, there might be some study that's coming out, or some new drug that's about to get to approved. And you have kind of this idea. But in cybersecurity, you wake up one day and then you find out the world's on fire. Remember WannaCry? That was nasty. That was North Korea got a hold of a piece of weaponized logic that was built by the NSA. It was called Eternal Blue, and then they built a worm around the thing and then set the thing in Europe, or Log4j. Our career field is funny like that, because you'll get up one day and then your inbox is full, the whole dashboard is red, your entire week is done. That's just kind of the nature of it. And things they just kind of change on a dime. I remember the thing with Colonial Pipeline, or the attacks on the pipelines overseas. I'm a little bit surprised we haven't had attacks on infrastructure here with the wars going on. But change in business objectives or business models. Business objectives change all the time, and I think that's been one of the key lessons of the last 30 years, especially with the advent of the information age, has been to adapt or die. I mean, look at the businesses that aren't really Blockbuster. Polaroid is not what it once was. So you keep an eye on the business landscape, and then you have to adapt to it. And those business adaptations are going to reflect in your cybersecurity posture. We need to have a talk about that. Changes in infrastructure, changes in resources. So infrastructure changes at time. Maybe you're migrating from on-cloud to premise. Maybe you're going from premise to on-cloud. Maybe you're going through merger and acquisition. If you're acquiring another company that's equal size, then M&A is going to have a massive impact on cybersecurity. And then the last piece is going to be simply, improvements. Maybe you think we're already doing a fairly good job of this, but it never hurts to bring in a third party and then have a second set of eyes on this. To take a look at our cyber roadmap and see if there's ways that we can improve that. Look for course corrections. There's always a way to do something better. And me personally, I love the concept of a Lincoln-esque cabinet, where you have people with opposing points of view and competing points of view, looking at things and knocking ideas around and beating them up, and then kind of finding the best way forward for everybody. A little bit of friction, in my opinion, is great, provided that it generates light instead of heat. Next slide, please. Ongoing cyber concerns. So we'll talk about the cyber threat landscape a little bit, is going to be our last piece here before we wrap up in a couple of minutes. Next slide, please. Hasn't happened to us yet. We hear that a lot, unfortunately. And again, this, my house on the coast of Florida analogy, operating an information system is like operating a house on the coast of Florida, like buying a house on the coast of Florida. I know what's going to happen eventually. Might be this year, next year, or 5 years, but eventually there's going to be a storm, and it's just a matter of how big it is and how ready I am for it. But our first bullet here, average dwell time for ransomware is 23 days. Dwell time, that's when the bleeding starts. And what this means is this is when your adversary gets a toehold into your system. They've got a back door into it, some type of persistent access. And it's like bleeding, because we need to stop that triage. We need to start triage immediately. And for most SMBs, and really most businesses, most enterprises, it takes a while to find this stuff. And it's usually not until they make a mistake or they advertise their presence or we find it somehow. But 23 days is a lot. And that's why I use the bleeding analogy. If you're bleeding for 23 days, that's a real problem. But with the right mix of people, process, and technology, advanced protective technologies, things like SIEM and EDR, and having a SOC in place, we could get that dwell time down from weeks to hours, and that really matters. And again, going back to the bleeding example, we need to stop that as quickly as possible. Average downtime for ransomware is 21 days. So right off the top, this is 21 days of lost revenue, lost operations. Excuse me, because they try to make this hurt as much as possible. They will try to hit you where it hurts because they want you to pay. Average cost of a critical infrastructure data breach in 2021, $4.82 million. Because when they do these exfiltrations, these are usually tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of records. And even with small fines, that adds up. That can absolutely, the costs associated with the fines for losing this data are absolutely astronomical. And there's a lot of legislation that's coming down the pike. We see legislation in the different states, and some of the legislation that's come out of Europe with personal privacy protection has been pretty good. The GDPR isn't bad. Now the United States, of course, is a republic, and there's no authority in the Constitution for the federal government to really regulate this, even though they do that to an extent anyway. So it's kind of left on the states in order to do this in a strictly legal academic sense. Cyber insurance policy renewals are skyrocketing or not being renewed. Insurance, cybersecurity insurance is a different animal than regular insurance, and insurance has been around forever. I mean, think about, Lloyd's of London insuring the East India Trading Company. But cyber insurance is new. It's not like life insurance or homeowners insurance or auto insurance where they have decades or in some cases centuries of this actuarial data to gauge their risk in a very precise way. So with homeowners insurance, car insurance, life insurance, you get this checkbox, right? And 10 questions, and then they have a very good idea. Cyber insurance is not like that. Do not pencil whip these things. You have to read the entire thing and make sure you understand all of it. And if there's any questions that are on your cyber insurance policy that you don't understand, then reach out to Quattro and they will explain that to you. But for this reason, we're seeing that the premiums are going up or they're not renewing because the underwriters they're losing tons of money on this because, again, it's a new business base. They don't understand it that well. And my biggest advice for buyers for cyber insurance is caveat emptor, buyer beware. Not like building insurance, not like life insurance. Pump the brakes, take your time, work with an expert, and make sure you understand exactly what you're buying, exactly what the coverages are before you sign on it. Because the risk is if you're not doing exactly what you're telling them that you're doing and you have some type of a breach that they're not going to pay and there's going to be litigation. So just like I said, just caveat emptor. The impact of cyber warfare is truly untested today. This is something that I happen to know a lot about from my days of working in the classified realm, and then from where I'm also on the Congressional Task Force for Electromagnetic Pulse, and I get briefings and this kind of stuff. And not to be too scary, but I've been frankly very surprised that that we haven't had any counterattacks on our infrastructure here, whether it's the grids or the water or C4IR or any of that stuff. But we'll see what happens with what's going on overseas. The impact of the reputation of an organization is undeniable. Cyber, and this is why a lot of organizations will try to hide them when they can. But you look at these, the big breaches, their market cap drops because of these things. You look at Target and Equifax and that kind of thing. It hurts their market cap for a period of time. It's crazy how much money this can cost a company. Next slide, please. Most data thieves are organized professional criminals deliberately trying to steal information they can turn into financial gain. That's completely true. The vast majority of this is just most of these attacks are coming from overseas. Believe it or not, only about 7% of the world's internet users are in North America. And in spite of that, something like 90% of the cyber attacks are on Americans. And that's because, we're the richest country in the world. And then people turn on TV and they say, well, Americans have giant houses and pretty families and cars and all that stuff. So they're just basically just plain old robbery. Most of it is just trying to steal money. 40% of ransomware incidents involve RDP, remote desktop sharing software. I do not like to see RDP exposed to the internet at all. There are use cases for it. I still find it when we do assessments, it's a dangerous practice. It's like leaving your car door unlocked and then leaving it in the parking lot at a Chicago Cubs game or something like that. It's just asking for it. Please don't do this. And if you're running RDP, when you have a risk assessment done with Quattro, they will find that for you. And if there's a use case for it where you have to have it, then we can put in compensating controls, VPN intrusion detection, those kinds of things. 62% of system intrusion incidents involve threat actors compromising an organization's partners. You know what this means is this was a big problem in defense. You can't get into it. Trying to break into Boeing or Walker or something like that is difficult. But, these companies, a lot of companies will publish their contracts in RFPs and RFIs and that kind of thing. So you could find out who they work with, who their business relationships are with. And let's say I used to work for Sierra Nevada. They had contracts with the Department of Defense, and the contracts are public. You could go look and then see who the subcontractors are, and then they would attack the subcontractors, learn about the supply chain, and then move up. So a lot of the major breaches we see, this was true in the case of Target, that breach happened through their HVAC contractor. So the other companies that you're working with that are providing products and services to you, or especially if they're connected to your network, they introduce risk that we need to talk about as well. Next slide, please. This is some data from the Verizon from the 2022 DBIR report, the Data Breach Investigation Report. And, the DBIR, this comes out every single year. It's been out every single year since 2008. It's 120, 130 pages. I'd say it takes 3-4 pots of coffee to get through this thing. It's something that us in the cyber realm read every single year. But according to Verizon, there's 4 key paths leading to the compromise of your state, credentials, phishing, exploit vulnerabilities, and botnets. And credentials, that's usernames and passwords. And from having done penetration testing, I could tell you that stealing usernames and passwords is easy to do. There's a variety of technical administrative ways to do that, whether it's rainbow tables, brute force attacks, social engineering, phishing, which leads us to phishing. And the reason that phishing is so pervasive is simply because it works, period. It's just like junk mail. We all get junk mail in your box, right? Physical junk mail, snail mail, oil changes, windows. The reason they do that is because it works. This is the law of averages. If you send out 100,000 of those things, maybe 30,000 people or 3,000 people will look at it, and then maybe 30 will convert. And the same is true of phishing. You send out a million phishing emails, which is cheap and easy and low risk. Maybe 30,000 people click on it. Out of that 30,000, maybe 300 will have open attack vectors, and then you infect 30 of them or whatever. So the ROI is definitely there for them. They do that because it works. And I believe last time I checked, something like 85% of the email that traverses the global email systems, the mail transport agents daily is junk mail. It's crazy, staggering figure. Exploit vulnerabilities. Usually we think about technical means, things like phishing, worms, viruses, but an exploit vulnerability could be a social engineering attack or a phishing attack, or frankly, trying to sneak into buildings and that kind of things. I have colleagues that do that sort of thing. The bottom here is botnets. I'm going to spend a second on this because I find that when I talk about it live, that people don't normally know what it is. And a botnet is why an attacker is interested in grandma's computer or interested in the computer in the back room of a candy shop. When they're looking for targets, this is an automated process. There are machines that troll the internet looking for things that are connected that they can exploit. And it's automated. Think about, blue whales trolling the ocean looking for krill. They're just vacuuming up the krill and they spit out what they don't want. It goes right through. So they find grandma's computer and then they install a backdoor on it, and they might log into it and look at it and say, "Oh, this thing's useless. There's nothing here." And there's Sudoku and Candy Crush on it. So they leave the backdoor there, but then they have 10,000 or 100,000 of these bots, right? That they've infected with this malware, and they all connect back to what's called a command and control server. So now I have them connected to a command and control server. Let's say I want to attack something big, something like Verizon or something like ConnectWise or something like Boeing. Well, now I have this botnet, 100,000 computers, and I could use it as in the military, we would call that a force multiplier to attack that. And oh, by the way, you could rent botnets off of the dark web like a cheap motel in a bad neighborhood for an hourly rate. Bitcoins, and they do not care what you do with it. They do not care. They don't ask. They just don't care. Next slide, please. Business email compromise, according to the FBI, accounts for 31% of cyber crime losses in 2021. And, these numbers really, we have ideas, but they're kind of guesses, because this isn't like violent crime or like breaking and entering or like car accidents. We tend to have pretty hard data on that, but not all cyber events are actually reported. So it's probably actually higher than this. Business email compromise continues to really be pervasive. The numbers keep going up, and they've really fine-tuned their methods a lot. When ransomware started happening, at first they were asking for like ridiculous sums. It reminded me of Dr. Evil, $1 million. They would be asking, a Jiffy Lube for $1 million, and here they're asking General Motors for, $10,000 or something like that. But they don't do that anymore. When they find a target that's actually worth attacking, normally they'll do some reconnaissance, and then they'll try and figure out how many employees are and get some idea of what your revenue is. And then they like to set it like 10% of top line revenue. So, let's say you're $1 million top line business, they might ask for $100,000. But if your operating margins are low, say your operating margins or your EBIT is low, how are you going to afford $100,000 to pay this? You're going to go out of business, but they're very methodical, and they're really they're cranking the numbers up as high as they could possibly get away with. I'm trying to get as many feathers out of the goose as they can with the minimum amount of hissing. Estimated U.S. loss at $2.4 billion. It's a lot of money. By the way, at the bottom here, you see FBI Internet Crime Report, IC3 report.gov. If you have a cyber attack and you don't need to report it legally, and you don't want to, at a minimum, please report it to ic3.gov so that we have the data. They might not necessarily do anything about it, but at least then we have the data, and it helps us to make sure that our numbers are accurate. We know what's going on. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about cryptocurrency a little bit. Cryptocurrency is the main way that attackers like to get paid because it's going to be mainly untraceable, and this is going to be a problem for the foreseeable future. And I've heard some rumors about trying to stop ransomware by regulating cryptocurrency. But according to the FBI, about 1/5 of cybercrime involves cryptocurrency. That's a whole other subject we could spend hours on as well. Next slide, please. Ransomware as a service is a production line of organized crime. The places that are targeting you, they look, act, smell, taste, and function and are structured exactly like real businesses. It's just that what they're doing is immoral and unethical, and it might not even be illegal where they happen to be. If you're in, Belarus and you're attacking Americans, there's no laws against that in Belarus. They don't care what you're doing. So these, they're companies. They're literally companies, and they have engineers, they have financial targets, they have project managers, they have help desk, they have all of these things. And they even, they think about ways to scale. And that's what ransomware as a service is. So they have their ransomware, and then they put it in a kit that's like a kit from IKEA, and then they send it out to people that can buy it for some fee, and they actually provide support for it, and then they get some percentage of that, and that's how they can scale from $1 million to $2 or $3 million or something like that without hiring additional people. So they really act. They're very capitalistic. Frankly, it's amazing. Next slide, please. Paying the ransom really works. On average, 65% of data is restored after paying the ransom. I think it's actually higher than this. Remember what I mentioned earlier about the statistics not being completely accurate because it doesn't always get reported. I think it's actually higher than this. And I say this because the threat actors they're very careful about protecting their business model, protecting their revenue stream. And the way to protect their revenue stream is to protect their business model in the same way that any other company will protect their business model. So they know that they have to provide the service that they say they're going to provide when you pay them, and that service is decrypting your data. And then, if this happens to you, this becomes a very personal decision. Law enforcement will always tell you not to pay it. That's their position on it. My position is, well, it depends. You could be, let's say you're a small business and you're first or second generation, maybe you started it or your parents started it. If you don't pay this, you're going to go out of business. You're going to go bankrupt. Now it's a business decision. Am I doing okay on time? I'm a little bit.
You've got 5 minutes or a little less than 5 minutes here. So I want to leave some time for questions here.
Okay. If we could. We'll finish up then. Leave a couple minutes for, what's our next slide though? We have some pending regulation up. Always keep your eye out for regulation, depending on what state you're in, what locality. They could be different. Next slide. That's important. Regulations impact this. Recently, the federal government is now trying to they're trying to regulate what they can in order to affect the cyber landscape. There's only so much they can do, but they're doing these things through the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency and making reporting requirements and some other things, trying to improve the situation. Next slide, and then we'll go ahead and we have 5 minutes left for but that's right there. And the only way to prevent, the first step in all of this is going to be your risk assessment.
Questions, anyone? You can type it into the chat dialogue.
I know we have one. Real quick, how pervasive is ransomware?
I talked about, there's all these statistics. We have all these statistics, and the statistics, they vary a little bit depending on whether you talk to the to the FBI or whether you talk to Interpol, or you talk to Verizon or you talk to Sophos. There's some variation in there, and I think the numbers are normally higher. But somebody asked me this the one time, and I thought about it. And I said, honestly, it's probably about as pervasive as graffiti when you think about it, because imagine you go into a city. I'm in you go to Detroit or whatever. Imagine if you tried to have law enforcement clean up all the graffiti. It's an untenable problem. So it's something where the first responder really is you, and it really is that pervasive. It's kind of really everywhere. But the problem is you don't see it. If the business that's next to you is having a ransomware attack right now, you're not going to know. It's not like a car drove into it. Or the building's on fire, you're not going to know. So it's not that visible, but it is very pervasive. And like I said, the best analogy I have, I think it's about as pervasive as graffiti. It's crazy how much this is going on, and we need to protect people.
We have time for one more quick question here. Let me see here. When it comes to reporting these leaks, is it standard practice to report to local law enforcement, or are there specific agencies?
It really depends. I tell people always report it to ic3.gov so that we have statistics. And you can notify local law enforcement depending on where you are. Most of the time, they're not going to have any resources, but it really depends. Where I live, we don't even have a police department. I live in a rural community, but I've talked to people that live in, for example, LA County, and they do have a cyber crime unit there. So it depends on where you live. But you want to notify, report it to ic3.gov, make a report with the FBI, and then make a report with local and law enforcement. But they probably won't be able to help you. But it is recommended for trend analysis, and they may be able to mobilize resources for you. And then it's also very important to contact your legal counsel and then also your insurance company.
All right, we got a minute left here. So let's wrap this up. We're going to be following up with each of you on providing a complimentary dark web scan report. We talked about the dark web scan just to see whether there's any exposed credentials for your company domain. Many of you have registered with your public email domain, like a google.com or outlook.com account. So we'll need to confirm what is your company domain for us to run that report on. And then we'll be sending you an email for you to choose between a $75 Grubhub or Uber Eats, as well as letting you know the winner of the raffle. And that's it. So thanks again. I hope you found this webinar useful, and stay safe.
Really appreciate you having me. It's always a pleasure to present for our partners. And I always have trouble sticking to that 50 minutes.
No worries.
Thanks,
Good information. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Robin.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.